You're listening to the Curio-city Collective podcast.
I'm Arpita.
And I'm Deepika.
Are you thinking of quitting your job? If so, then you are not alone. A global survey of 2021 revealed that 54% employees considered leaving their current employer if some sort of post-pandemic flexibility was not offered.
Do you like your job? Does going to work make you happy? Or would you rather be at home with your family or do something else?
Looks like we're about to kick off season 2 with some intense questions.
I know, right? Those questions do sound intense. But if we are going to talk about well-being in cities, what's a better place to start than the one where most of us spend a large chunk of our days, the workspace?
Yeah, and in the last 2 years, both work and the workplace have found themselves unwillingly transformed as per the whims of a virus.
And these changes, along with all the other things that the pandemic brought, seem to have put this lens on the way work has shaped up and affected our lives in the last couple of decades.
In a May 2021 Bloomberg article, Anthony Klotz, an associate professor of management at Texas A&M University, who studied the exits of hundreds of workers, very prophetically announced that the Great Resignation is coming. The numbers are multiplied, he says, by the many pandemic-related epiphanies about family time, remote work, commuting, passion projects, life and death, and what it all means that can make people turn their back on the 9-to-5 office grind.
So today we thought we'd explore what happened during the pandemic with the help of some people who did something different with their jobs and lives during this 2-year period. And the first of those is Ashwini.
My name is Ashwini Someshwar. I'm 38 years old, of which I've been married for 13 years. We have a 9-year-old daughter. I work for an IT product company. Been there for over 5 years now. I've been working in corporate for over 17 years.
Ashwini works with the Human Resource or HR department, a role in which she has to support the needs of a team within the organization.
And from the very corporate, we head to the world of fashion with Arjun.
Hi, I'm Arjun. I live in Bangalore currently. I'm a fashion designer by profession. I've been in the fashion industry for about 10 odd years.
And fittingly for both of us, our third chat was with Arundhati, who is from a sector most familiar to the two of us, the development sector.
Hi, I'm Arundhati. I work in the development sector as a consultant. My main interests lie in the area of gender and development and organizational development. But I'm currently based in Bangalore, was formerly based in Gujarat.
Last and of course far from being the least is Abbas, who works in good old Bollywood.
So my name is Abbas Khan and I live in Bandra, Mumbai. Most of my career, that is about close to 14 years, have been spent working actively with on the production side of films, advertising and television series. I have been producing, the last few years I've been producing TV series and movies.
4 people and 4 very different areas of work.
Yeah, but I think while they're each very different, it is useful to also remember how they're similar. They're all largely jobs within the formalized work structure and qualify as what we might commonly call white-collar jobs.
Right, in comparison to blue-collar ones, which are often understood as those involving high physical or manual labor and often come with very poor pay and security.
Exactly. So today we are speaking of work in the context of white-collar jobs. And I think what's useful to remember as we begin is that, like you said, white-collar jobs are seen as better paying, offering more security and clearer protections. They are often the dream of the masses, most of whom work within the informal blue-collar sector.
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. And I think interesting because in one way, the question at the heart of the conversation today is what went wrong with the dream, right? I mean, these are jobs people wanted. So what's gone wrong and what needs remedying? Okay, so where do we begin?
Well, let's begin with how life was pre-pandemic.
So before the pandemic, I was working in an organization that was extremely grassroots based. So I had work that was pretty much round the clock and 6 days a week. So it used to mean early morning travel to the field and then on Mondays and then staying in the field almost through the week. traveling back on Saturdays to my home base, and then pretty much spending Sunday just barely catching a breath before Monday morning again. So that was basically work hours.
It wasn't just Arundhati who was doing very long hours. All four of them seemed to echo this experience.
Yeah, and this is Abbas.
This is based out of the locations that we're filming at. They're long days, sometimes 14, 15, 16-hour days. Whereas the office days, the pre-prod and the post-production phases sort of include regular office hours, extended regular office hours, about a 9-10 hour day on an average.
And Ashwini?
It was a full day's work. Work didn't end just when we left offices. So I think when I would come back, I'd probably get a quick break to do something back home. And then, we'd probably need to get back into meetings later in the evening. So yeah, I would say it was quite, it was quite full already. In fact, I think I was almost struggling with it sometimes, right?
And Arjun?
So I remember when I wanted to do fashion, I remember telling everyone saying, I don't want a 9-to-5 job. I don't want a 9-to-5 job. And I think I got my wish because I used to work 9 to 11 in the fashion industry, which I wasn't prepared for. But yeah, that's pretty much how our days used to be, pretty much 10-11 hours a day work.
And then the meager weekends would end up becoming catch up with life chores, rest, and back to the grind again.
Weekends I would just probably go play cricket or play some music with someone or go out, get a drink. That's all. You know how the weekends fly, right? So before you know it, it's Monday morning again.
Some might say that considering the fact that these jobs are in the higher tier of income, one shouldn't complain about long hours because they compensate adequately. So a bit of perspective could be useful here. A 2021 ILO report revealed that Indians were among the most overworked and underpaid workers in the world. And here we aren't speaking of just the blue-collar workers. It pointed out that among Indians, it is the well-paid employees, both salaried and self-employed, in urban areas who work longer than those in the rural parts of the country. Just the kind of people we are speaking to today.
Right, so while they might be doing better in the arena of income, the working hours are far from ideal or even expected when one compares to the hours similar workers across the globe are expected to keep.
And added to the working hours most of them were already putting in, there was the expectation of even more.
In the development sector, I think there is a real sense of martyrdom that comes with any work that you do, any social change work that you do, and an expectation that you will burn yourself out. So if you're complaining about the fact that you're not doing well or feeling well, there is not really space that holds that either.
As people who've been part of the development sector, this seems pretty familiar, this valorization of burnouts and, to keep going come what may.
And even pre-pandemic, she was already feeling its effects.
I was starting to feel like it was really wearing me down. There was a real physical burnout that I could feel, but also a very real emotional burnout that was starting to affect all my personal relationships, where I just found myself being really short with people, being unable to give emotionally in relationships around me, being very snappy, very quick to lose my temper.
While not classified as a medical condition, burnouts are recognized by the World Health Organization in their diagnostic tool, the International Classification of Diseases. They define burnout as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And they say that it's largely characterized by 3 dimensions. One is feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion. 2, increased mental distance from one's job or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job. And then the 3rd, reduced professional efficacy.
Some of which Arundhati is describing here.
And what's interesting is that while Arundhati was dealing with the unreal expectations within the development sector, Ashwini was facing something quite similar in her very corporate environment.
I guess the competition was always on, and I guess the expectation was always that, if you've done X, then, next year you would do about 1.5X, right? Which is very hard to keep up with unless you change your job or unless you change your role. So I think that bit of racing for more and more was very much a part of the culture that was set, not just in my team, but across the company, and I think across many companies within this sector.
This meant that there were rough patches when tasks became so overwhelming that Ashwini found herself pulling all-nighters to cope and leaving her too exhausted to do much else. Days when her partner or family would have to pitch in massively to help her cope and catch up with her rest. And here it's useful to remember that Ashwini actually works for a company that values empathy and has built-in systems which support employees in times of need and is seen as one of the best companies to work in.
Yet the larger corporate culture of pushing yourself more and more and living with the expectation of outperforming your previous goals was constantly looming, right?
Exactly.
I do think sometimes that expectations were set a certain way, perceptions were built a certain way because of the kinds of timings someone would put in, or because of the kinds of ways that certain people would show up. You know, I stayed up all night to hear a 2 a.m. meeting. Oh, really? What went on it? You know, could you tell us more? And that person would get the center stage, while the rest of us who chose to probably sleep didn't.
To sleep or not to sleep? That seems like a very unfair ask. And so what we're seeing is that across sectors, many are already feeling stretched by unrealistic demands, long hours, and interspersed with periods when things were very rough and hard to manage.
What ends up happening is that there is a glorification of busy. There is a constant glorification of busy that's happening in every single part of it, and it's all pervasive in terms of with my friends, you know, always talking about it, my family always talking about it. It's very difficult to create a different value structure when you're so surrounded by placing value in being busy.
Like Arundhati says, there was no simple out because it's not just about their organizations, but also the culture of their sectors. And it's good to remember here that while this might not be the case for the women we spoke to, for most women juggling remunerator work with other unpaid care-based work of raising children, managing family social obligations and ties, and running homes is still very much a reality. Hence, it's not surprising that there is a gender angle to the experience of burnouts. For example, a survey by Harvard Business Review using 2018-19 data showed that the well-being of women was already suffering at work pre-pandemic. They reported higher stress levels in larger numbers than men. And of course, there were other finer dynamics such as women with children or of color showing even higher stress levels.
Right. So with that, we come to March 2020 and the pandemic hits.
And so much changed dramatically overnight as very strict lockdowns got instituted.
In the initial days, there was so much fear. There was so much sort of uncertainty around what COVID is, you know, sort of how does it transmit? And the first wave sort of was devastating the world over. You know, the risks involved for personal health and safety. And that kept all of us, as in the whole filmmaking fraternity, sort of confined to our homes, waiting for sort of things to change, waiting for sort of possible medical solutions, for vaccines, for easing of regulations in terms of you can't, as the sort of initial easing of regulations happened, whether in India or overseas, you still can't film with, say, 4, 5, 10 people, you know, big projects. You need big teams to come together to execute that.
For Abbas and the entire film industry, where little could be done without large teams physically meeting up for shoots and post-production work came to an abrupt and uneasy pause.
The film industry is very project-based, and when it shuts down like that, many livelihoods are affected across the board. It isn't strictly a typical white-collar job. While Abbas as a producer would certainly be more financially secure, this isn't true for a large number of people who work in the industry, so I can imagine the uncertainty was immense. And the film industry is really far from the only such one.
Really, each of our chats for me represents a different element of the very complex experience that was the pandemic. For as many face the deep uncertainty of a complete lockdown of their industry, others face the escalation of work in theirs. Arundhati, being a part of the development sector, found herself inundated by the many issues that arose because of the lockdowns.
We were dealing with the migrant crisis and the hunger problem and the shadow pandemic, which was the violence against women. All three of them hit us pretty hard, and all three of them were so closely tethered to a state and a system that don't care.
As a senior member of the NGO she was working in, she felt compelled to show up day in and out, irrespective of how exhausted she herself was feeling. And she wasn't just responding to the lockdown and pandemic-related issues only. She found herself informally becoming the sounding board for her co-workers who were struggling through the crisis themselves.
So if somebody had feelings or issues, people would just say, "Oh, why don't you speak to Arundhati?" And why don't you speak to her, because she's been speaking to all of us. So I think that that sort of over time just formalization of people of how that was the role that I played. This was in addition to an incredible amount of work that we were doing on the side, both relief and rehabilitation.
And to top it, there was the overwhelming stress of managing and watching over all of one's housework alongside her partner, even as they were taking care of their parents and their own health needs.
You end up having to cook, you end up having to take care of the house. There was a lot of other expectations of generally looking out for one another that had to be done. Emotionally also, both of us were really, really, really affected because of several things that were happening in our personal life. And so there was a lot of emotional care labor that we were doing for one another all the time, with extremely depleted resources.
I can really relate to that. I mean, in fact, so many of us would. As home and office merged during the pandemic, one wasn't just looking after work needs, but there were children to raise, homes to run, caregiving for older members of the family, for self and partners. And as research after research is now telling us, as expected, it was especially more difficult and overwhelming for women because of how traditionally care work is seen as their domain.
And at her IT company, Ashwini, on the other hand, initially experienced a milder office structure.
I think I was working maybe 2 to 3 hours in a day, and that's it. And that was just fine. We've always had a work from home option at the company that I'm in. So it was really easy for this one to shift its entire workforce to work from home.
It allowed her family a few easy initial months of adjusting into the new normal, as they began calling it then.
I suppose the scenario changed as the months piled on and companies began to fall back into their old patterns.
You guessed it. Workloads increased significantly even as little else changed. And suddenly the lull was over and the storm was on.
So simply put, I went completely crazy. Me, my husband, everyone, right? Everyone in the household went completely bonkers because we literally couldn't find 5 minutes when we were free. So I think it just turned into very mechanical, robotic lives where we wake up in the morning, get the housework done, jump into our meetings, and then keep juggling between meetings and, sitting with the kid for her online classes, somehow going from one meeting to another and having to switch contexts, having to switch, content of what you're thinking, what are you doing. I think creativity took a big hit because it was just about getting through every day. And by the end of the day, I think we were so exhausted, we'd just fall flat on our backs and go to sleep, just to wake up the next day and do it all again.
And to think that work escalations began happening post the first year, that is in 2021, the same year that India experienced the second and worst wave of the pandemic. Literally each one of us knew someone who'd suffered greatly or died because of COVID in that period.
Yeah, and it was such a frantic and anxious period. Ambulances used to blare on the streets the whole day for a long time. It was a terrible and heartbreaking period, and to sit with this overwhelming sense of horror, pain, ache of what we were collectively experiencing and then somehow continue to work seems so inexplicable.
It just felt like the amount of pressure that I had at work just felt like I was probably making vaccines for COVID or something. Whereas I was just making clothes at the end of the day, right? So it just didn't feel like such a big deal, but that's how my work used to feel, that it was a really big deal.
I remember a lot of people echoing urgent sentiments from that period. People were juggling work even as their families fell sick, as public health systems crashed, And we all sort of lived in this prolonged experience of direct or vicarious grief and anxiety.
And somehow that juxtaposition is really powerful for a lot of us facing the fragile mortality of our loved ones and our own in this very stark manner. Really put a lot of things in perspective. For Arjun, as it turned out, the decision was to quit.
While we were all transitioning into work from home and new modes of work and all of that, there was still no, just felt like, nobody was really trying to understand what everyone was going through individually and how tough it was to transition into these new modes of work. And that's what was the last straw for me.
Wow, yes. One can see and feel even how all of this has been building up for a while. Though, remote work was one of the really big outcomes of this whole pandemic period. And while being stuck inside the house 24/7 was no one's favorite way of doing things, I think people and organizations very quickly began to realize that there was something interesting to the ability to trust people to work remotely from places that they were happier to function out of. Not only did it mean hiring lesser office space and other resources for the organization, but individuals also seemed to see some value in it, even outside of the context of the pandemic.
Yes, and this is something we see in the case of Abbas, who was used to an erratic 24/7 schedule of the film and ad industry. He made the mid-pandemic decision to shift from project-based work, which needs massive presence and hands-on management, to working full-time with Amazon Prime, which gave him the structure and ability to do things differently.
The interesting thing for me was that for the first time ever in my career, in my life, this sort of a working profile or this working environment remotely allowed me to actually work out of any location possible. So I didn't have to be confined to my house per se, or, an office per se. I could do the same job as long as I had a good working internet connection. I could do the job from anywhere in the country.
There was something freeing about being untethered, and all the more during the pandemic, where living in small apartments in congested cities was taking a severe toll on people. So we heard so many stories of people who took this opportunity to travel or to be in different surroundings because remote work allowed for it.
I decided to sort of move up to the hills in close to Dharamshala, and I took up a small place there along with my partner and spent another few months working out of there, which was thoroughly enjoyable. Although the hours were long and the work was intensive, but the fact that I was close to nature, something that I enjoy a lot. I could, with whatever time off that I did have, I could go out and explore the environment around me, go out for walks, go out for hikes, and enjoy sort of the cold weather in the north, although this was in the middle of the monsoon.
I think the need for being able to be out in the world, and especially within nature, became so profoundly felt during the lockdowns, and being able to do something like this was both special and precious.
And while in the pandemic this became a big conversation, it does seem that it was a conversation that's been waiting to happen. Pre-pandemic, many smaller countries around the world had already come up with special digital nomad visas for remote workers. They would provide the ambience and the internet to enable you to work and live with ease. And in return, the digital nomad would enrich the local economy by buying and spending there. So it's not surprising that since the pandemic, more and more countries are working towards making themselves look good to digital nomads.
And I think even if one didn't travel, there was something lovely about being able to spend more time with your family, your kids, and especially not having to do the tedious, exhausting, long work commute. Maybe it wasn't immediately evident because so much was happening in 2022, but we're definitely seeing more people welcoming the idea of continuing with hybrid work, some days in the office mixed with some days at home.
Definitely. And, we'll come back to that in the conversation ahead. But for now, let's return to what happened as a result of the waves of COVID in India, especially the second most devastating one.
One of the major reasons I finally ended up putting in my papers actually was that my father got COVID.
Already beleaguered and exhausted, Arundhati asked her organization for leave so that she could look after her 60-plus-year-old parents who lived close by.
I need to cook food and deliver it to their place every day. This is something, and make runs to the hospital for tests, for medicines, for a ton of things. And I said this to the organization, and I got an email from HR saying, you don't have any leaves pending, so this will be leave without pay, or something extremely tone deaf at that moment. And it felt even more in that moment how little I was being seen, or my situation was being seen, or my hurt pain was being felt by the organization. A daughter saying that she does not have the ability to show up because she's not sure if her father will make it through. And that, I think, at that point was really, that I think hurt the most. That felt like the biggest betrayal.
It was an unprecedented and overwhelming time. And organizations being so tone deaf and insensitive, as she put it, just made things so much worse.
And while Arjun and Arundhati found themselves overwhelmed and decided to take the decision to quit, Ashwini was caught in a different bind.
So my child has special needs, and she needs more attention when it comes to her education.
Midst the mayhem of juggling so many tasks, her child's school informed her that they were no longer feeling up to the task of supporting her child's unique needs. This meant that they needed to find her a new schooling space that worked for her.
So as a family, we just took the decision to make it easy on all of us, and that this was priority, and it helped that my company was 100% supportive. So all things put together, we decided that I would take a break from work and invest that time and energy in making sure that she has what she needs in preparation for this academic year. And
this sounds easy, but I bet there must be long conversations behind such a decision.
Of course, quitting or taking a break are far from easy decisions. For each of them, the decision came in the wake of being heavily pushed, and even when it was taken, questions always did linger. Quitting, leave taking, especially for mental health, or even long sabbaticals are all often still frowned upon and seen as, quote unquote, bad career moves, even if this isn't openly said.
So I was wondering, how long I can actually afford to be off work. What happens to my financial independence, job security, boredom, or whether I would end up being a helicopter parent. I think there were a lot of questions of identity as well, because I always associated what I did as a big part of who I am.
Yeah, and the kind of society we now live in, when one first meets, the second question after any exchange of names is, what do you do? And of course, it implies explaining the sector you work in and the job you do. So like Ashwini says, it's become very intertwined with our sense of self.
At a point when I was taking time off a few years back, when people used to ask me what I did, as a bit of a self-entertaining social experiment, I used to give these answers like, they'd say I'm an accountant or I work in this sector. And I'd go, yeah, and I wander gardens and sit by trees, grow plants and read lots. And it would leave people looking totally baffled and confused, as if I had given the wrong response to a coded question in a spy movie.
Yeah, it's like the rest of what we do has become secondary, and the job, the thing that is the indicator of our economic place in the world, has just come to define us over all else, whether we like it or not.
Well, luckily for Ashwini, though, she did not have to quit.
So I asked for 3 months to just take some time to figure out what we needed to do. But my manager actually insisted that I take 8 months off. And that would take me till the end of the academic year. And that was such a big relief. I mean, the minute she said it, my entire body just relaxed.
I don't think I've ever heard of an instance where a manager asks you to take more time off than less.
And really, I thought this is one of those times one sees the difference between a good organizational response and a poor one. Where Arundhati's organization came across as tone deaf, Ashwini's responded to her crisis situation with understanding, making her feel genuinely supported, seen, and enabled. But there was more to what helped Ashwini settle into her break.
My husband, he knows, how I stress about some of these things. So he actually decided that, a part of his salary would just come into my account on a monthly basis. And, he understood how important independence is for me. So I think there was just a surge of very security instilling actions that came in from, the rest of my family, from my friends, and from my organization. And all of that put together, I was easily able to take the decision that I needed to take some time off my work and focus on my daughter.
I love that. The pandemic really brought forth the conversation on unpaid care work that goes into running houses, maintaining social support systems and ties, a larger load of which is carried by women in our gendered society. Just recognizing that and responding to that within households is really important.
Research by Oxfam showed that on a regular day, women in Asia spend 4.1 times more time in care work than men. And like you said, with reduced access to support and with greater responsibility of care work with children and vulnerable elders at home, another bit of research showed that women were 7 times more likely to lose work during the nationwide lockdown, and conditional on losing work, 11 times more likely to not return to work subsequently compared to men.
So if we are to genuinely enable women to be in workspaces, we need to have structures and support systems both in offices and homes which begin to recognize this and make the change. Not something we haven't known, but definitely a realization that comes across more powerfully with the experience of the lockdowns and the pandemic.
And in these experiences and examples, I think we begin to unpack what can be done differently with work. When Arjun, Arundhati and Ashwini finally stepped out of their jobs and Abbas changed the way he did his job, they all noted that many things shifted.
I'm actually enjoying time for myself. I'm enjoying meals. I'm enjoying meeting friends, family, traveling, sunshine, a number of things which shouldn't, it should be a part of your day-to-day life. It shouldn't be such a once in a blue moon occasion, right? And I think this pandemic has forced me to do some things that I would otherwise have been so uncomfortable with, but it's also given me a chance to explore them, to come to terms with them, and to actually see that there can be a different way of living life. And it's now made me very comfortable with that.
Ashwini wasn't the only one who reported the joy of suddenly finding quality time and the ability to give quality attention to the important people in her life.
I was seeking out friends, something I had not done in so long, because I just did not have the space for them in my life, because so much else was completely taking over, and just the inviting in of other people that I was able to do, that we were able to do as a couple, made us so much happier. It felt like gasping for air, It was like my mental health was like, it suddenly had access to so much oxygen, it felt like, and it was just didn't know what to do with.
Not only that, they were also able to find new hobbies and develop other interests.
It's been exactly a year since I've been out of work, and it's been great. So to answer your question on what life has been outside of this, it's been great. I've been able to get back in touch with some of my hobbies and spend some more time at home and just do basic things like cook meals and chill and listen to music, or just to be able to find time to do the little things that you always tend to put off. And to realize the amount of joy those little things bring in, and to have forgotten all of that in the last 10-12 years, that's been amazing.
Ashwini went on to do a yoga instructor's course.
Recently, what's most exciting is I have qualified as a yoga teacher, so that's been an interesting addition to my skills.
And Arundhati discovered gardening.
It feels like love, it feels like care, it feels like the kind of thing that I want to be associated with and be in. So it's something that allows for your life to have multiple avenues of interests and hobbies and relationships, and being able to have the time to cultivate meaningful relationships.
That sounds beautiful. I think even as we spoke to them, we could sense the change in tone when we came to this part of the conversation. Be it working from a different setting that allowed more flexibility, taking a break, or just quitting altogether from the job, the outcome of better physical and mental health was immediately evident to each of them.
Yeah, Arundhati shared how even her periods, which had been painful in the past, almost immediately became much more regular and pain-free. The reduction of stress and the genuine ability to rest and be transformed the quality of lives they were living.
I think it's reminded me of priorities. It's reminded me of my own health, just how short life can be. It's also shown me that work is important. It makes one, feel useful. It gives you independence. It helps you explore your creativity, your problem solving. It keeps me constantly learning new things. Separating life from home, that's a good one. That's an important one to have as well. But if it doesn't stay within its limit of just being a part of life, then I think it does go on to squeezing all the goodness away, from everything else, till you find yourself just sitting in a seat and constantly trying to tick off some to-dos from a list that is never ending, right? So while I did think about all of these things pre-pandemic a number of times, and I've had all kinds of emotional upheavals because of it, I think it's given me the courage. It's just given me the courage to think differently.
I don't know if we can say this enough, really. The pandemic was and continues to be that collective, historic, life-changing experience that's affected each of us in so many profound ways.
And I think often that this clamor of returning to a previous normal does not do justice to all the wisdom that has emerged from this tremendous period of churning. And the wisdom about how we should be working is a critical arena.
I really didn't believe before the pandemic that it was possible to work the way that I have been, or sort of how the world has shifted to sort of remote working with flexible hours, locations, and so on. So certainly that's the big shift in terms of something that I thought which was impossible. And I know that the same levels of productivity, efficiency can be maintained. We just needed to sort of take a step back, relook at our systems and our processes, mechanisms.
Abbas's words ring so very true. The extremes of the pandemic are mostly behind us now, and yet the hybrid work idea is still very much around, like we discussed.
And it's not just hybrid work. The pandemic was able to awaken us to the many ways in which, even though white-collar workers might have big incomes, the quality of life being lived might be questionable. So now other ideas which were in the margins before have suddenly found center stage. Ideas like 4-day weeks, for instance.
Oh yeah, in fact, I read about this really interesting experiment from before the pandemic that Microsoft did in its Japan office, where they tried a 4-day week.
Which seems like the perfect country to try this out in. Japan is known to have an unforgiving, exhausting work ethic, which has actually led to a phenomenon called karoshi, which literally translates to overworked death, and is often caused by heart attacks, strokes, or even suicide.
Exactly. So what Microsoft did was it gave its 2,300 employees 3-day weekends for the full month to assess the merits of a reduced work week, and the findings were extraordinary. The firm saw productivity rise 39.9% compared with the previous months, and the company also gained by the fewer resources being used thanks to the smaller work week.
And this really is only one of the many such experiments. Countries like Spain, Iceland, Belgium, and others have already begun trying out these 4-day weeks experimentally. And that is not all. The right to disconnect, the ability to say no to calls and mails from work beyond working hours is also finding takers, some even in India.
Think and ruin your well-deserved time off on a weekend like a phone call from your boss. So this may come as a heartwarming piece of news that certain members of parliament understand that and empathize with your pain. In an attempt to make all of our holidays better, a private member's bill has been introduced in the parliament to give employees the right to refuse official calls after office hours.
We're still distant from this being passed, but countries like France, Italy, Spain, and Ireland have already passed laws supporting the right to disconnect, and more may follow.
Yeah, it does look like stopgap measures will not do. Big structural changes are required.
So even as the world resumes to sort of office environments and regular pre-pandemic office hours, I would still seek a certain amount of flexibility with my work life to be able to work a certain amount of time remotely, work from home, as I have done over the last couple of years, whether that be fewer days in the office on a weekly basis, or whether that be sort of, taking a couple of months off regular sort of office life and working remotely in a year. Whatever opportunity sort of comes up in that manner, I would like to take that up.
I do believe that until you have a care policy in place, until you have different policies in place that speak to the ideology that you're saying, you're not really putting your money where your mouth is. You can say you really care about your employees, but if you don't have a mental health policy, if you don't have a care policy, if you don't have a creche policy, if you don't have any one of these things that helps to take some of the emotional care work off people, and actively show that the organization cares and sees what you're going through.
Amen to that, and a genuine return to life which is more fuller and vibrant.
As we were speaking, I was reminded of this essay by John Maynard Keynes,
the famous British economist known as the father of modern macroeconomics.
Exactly. And the essay was written in 1930 and was called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And Keynes back in 1930 predicted that in decades ahead, the number of hours of work would drastically reduce. And if I may quote him here, for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his permanent problem. How to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy leisure, which science and compound interest will have won for him, to live wisely and agreeably and well.
Wow, so he thought in the decades ahead, which I suppose is about now, we would have fewer hours of work and more time for just living life?
Yeah, and that's not all. There's more to the quote. It's a really lovely one. He added, the strenuous, purposeful money makers may carry all of us along with them into the lap of economic abundance, but it will be those people who can keep alive and cultivate into a fuller perfection the art of life itself and do not sell themselves for the means of life, who will be able to enjoy the abundance when it comes.
It does seem like the pandemic, for all its literal ills, did open something of a great possibility for us. A possibility to reconsider where we are and who we want to be. Indeed, as Keynes said, to reflect on and embody the art of life and living.
This conversation on rethinking work will continue in our online spaces, so do join us there. In our next episode, we continue exploring the topic of work, but this time from the perspective of gig workers. We look at the rise of gig work, the gig economy, and what changed through the period of the pandemic. Join us as we talk to Soumya Ashok, a freelance journalist who has conducted research on this, and listen in to get a glimpse of their everyday reality.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more episodes. You can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or a podcast app of your convenience. We're also on YouTube, so look up the channel, The Curio-city Collective, or follow us through our social media pages. And most importantly, if you like what you're hearing, please do share these episodes with your family, friends, and community members. Leave us your thoughts, comments, and feedback. We love hearing from you.
TCC is a not-for-profit initiative that is funded by you, the listeners. If you'd like to support the work that we do at TCC, there are different ways that are listed on the support and contribute page of our website, www.thecurio-citycollective.org. You can also write to us at team@thecurio-citycollective.org or message us on 6300711451 if you feel called to make a contribution to sponsor an episode or a podcast series. This could help us with our research, writing, admin, and editing costs to build further resources that speak to our collective well-being. We hope you'll join us on this journey of co-creating the space to nurture and build cities that are healthy and happy. This podcast was created by Srinidhi Raghavan, Deepika Khatri, and Arpita Joshi. The sound editing was by Vijay Chawla.